Season 2 of Euphoria came out 4 years ago, and 4 years is a long time, long enough for a show to change completely. Season 3 of Euphoria looks, sounds, and feels like a very different show. So let's talk about what happened and whether this season was worth the wait. When the first trailer dropped, it was obvious that this season would be different. New characters, a time jump, a new direction. That much was expected. What wasn't expected was just how disconnected it would feel from everything that came before. Watching the season 2 recap immediately beforehand only made the contrast even more obvious. Side by side, these two versions of the show look almost unrelated. The score only reinforced the change. Some moments overall work surprisingly well, while others feel imported from entirely different projects. There were times when, judging by the music choice, it felt more like I was watching an old spaghetti western, and I half expected Clint Eastwood to come out of the bush with a poncho, a cigarette in the corner of his mouth, and a revolver on his hip. Other times the music sounded more like it was from a big blockbuster movies, such as Interstellar or even The Da Vinci Code, which makes sense given Hans Zimmer's involvement. More than anything, the absence of Labyrinth is noticeable. His music was deeply intertwined into the emotional fabric of the earlier seasons, and without that presence, the score reaches some surprisingly low lows. One of the most widely criticized moments is Maddie's entrance to Cassie's and Nate's wedding. The visuals are promising, she's stunning, full of confidence, yet the music completely ruins it, and that is not the only scene that got ruined by the music. Several scenes suffer from similar choices, but the Cassie and Maddie party sequence in episode 4 really highlights the inconsistency and the disconnect from the emotional tone of the show, as if it doesn't fully understand the story it's supporting. The changes extend beyond the soundtrack. The makeup is less glittery, less that signature Euphoria style. The overall aesthetic of the interiors draws heavily from old Hollywood and the visual language of the 60s and 70s. More than once, the season evokes Tarantino vibes through its color palette and atmosphere. There are many other references and influences that are so pronounced and make it look like Sam Levinson experimenting with an entirely different creative project that just happens to share the same name as Euphoria. To me, the show already felt finished at the end of season 2. Rue survived, most of the major storylines reached a natural stopping point. If the series had never returned, I don't think I would have felt anything was missing. 4 years have passed between seasons 2 and 3, so significant changes were expected. Angus Cloud's death, as much as it was shocking, it also complicated a lot of things for the production team of the show. A lot of people disagree with how the show handled his absence, but it felt like the most natural solution available. We didn't really need a detailed explanation of what happened to his character. It was enough to acknowledge his presence and show that he was not forgotten. The long hiatus also led to several characters being written out, either due to behind-the-scenes issues or because the actors were no longer available. But how did all of these changes affect the characters who came back? As we all know, Euphoria was always a character-driven show, so the decision for it to become more outward-oriented, focusing on the world the characters live in instead of the characters themselves, was certainly a choice. Rue can still be considered the main character, but her role has changed significantly. In this season, she functions as a bridge between different groups of characters and as the entry point into Alamo's world. Her personality is noticeably different as well. Rue is less defined by grief and seems far more comfortable around other people than before. She's flirtatious and open to casual sexual experiences, which is not something she was known for previously. As the season progresses, this newfound confidence slowly gives way to fear. The deeper she gets involved with dangerous people, the more obvious it becomes that she's completely out of her depth. Towards the end of the season, Rue starts talking about wanting a family, children, and a stable future. She even discusses it with Jules. But what struck me is how little self-awareness she still seems to have. Rue talks about change as if it has already happened, yet she never stops to acknowledge how much pain she caused the people around her. Ironically, even though she appears to be clean this time around, everything still traces back to addiction. The main plot of this entire season exists because Rue took that suitcase from Lori in season 2. Every disaster that follows can be traced back to that decision. Even her death ultimately connects it to choices that she made years earlier. Some people blame Maddie for what happened, but realistically, Maddie was only one link in a chain that Rue started herself. As bleak as her ending is, it's difficult difficult to say it came out of nowhere. Rue never stood a chance of survival. She was far too broken for it. I can't say I like how her death was portrayed, as it is quite reminiscent of Angus Cloud's passing in real life, but it does add a certain heaviness to it all. However, what I did find somewhat unbelievable was that Alamo would never let Rue go and rely on the chance of her taking those pills. If this show had any logic, her death would likely have been far more violent. Despite all my issues with this season, Rue still remains the most recognizable version of herself, which is something that can't be said for some of the other characters. Nate, Cassie, and Maddie are also back, seemingly as a love triangle, but thankfully the show at least didn't fall into that trap as well. Nate undergoes the biggest transformation. People do change after high school, and that is normal. The problem is that season 3 asks us to accept years of character development that happened entirely off screen. One possible explanation is that Nate is finally free from the burden of his father's secret. For the first time in his life, he isn't carrying that weight around, but we don't see that. He simply shows up as a different person. His relationship with Cassie also makes very little sense. After everything that happened in season 2, it is difficult to understand how these two remained together long enough to get married. Even stranger is dynamic between them. His reactions to Cassie and her actions are completely out of character for him. Most of the time, Nate is a desperate liar who is in deep trouble because of his business debts, which is not unrealistic in itself. But was this the only way for his character to get a conclusion? Now, I'm not saying that Nate was ever a good person. He spent 2 seasons manipulating people, emotionally abusing his girlfriends, blackmailing others, and generally being one of the most toxic characters on television. But there is a difference between a character facing consequences for their actions and a character receiving punishment that does not fit their crimes. Cassie herself is a bit different this season. She has always been objectified, but she used to have depth. We had the opportunity to see how she felt on the inside and understand why she did what she did. This season, however, she's almost entirely defined by the monetization of her body. That can be accepted as a natural continuation of her character, but my issue with Cassie, and the reason I find her annoying this season, is that she often behaves childishly. And I mean that in the sense that she is overly eager and acts like a young girl who has come from a small town in the middle of nowhere to Los Angeles to chase her dreams. Her character is also used to push the idea that men should be men because their role is that of provider, hunter, and gatherer, which does make sense considering how Nate failed Cassie in that exact department, but it can also be read as a propaganda, which is a trap the season constantly falls in. At least this season, Cassie somewhat knows what she wants, and she's ready to do whatever it takes to get it. Through her desire to become famous, she reconnects with Maddie. Her relationship with Maddie in this season begins as a business transaction, but it takes a more emotional turn once they become linked to Alamo after Maddie asks for his help in saving Cassie and Nate. Call me crazy, but I never really bought the idea that Cassie and Maddie were the kinds of friends who would sacrifice everything for each other. Their relationship has always seemed superficial to me. So when the writer asks to believe one would risk her life to save the other, it feels more like the plot demanding it. That's something that naturally grows out of their relationship. Maddie is still pretty much similar to how she was as a character in seasons 1 and 2. We all know Maddie was always known for being confident. Aside from her fashion sense, it is one of the reasons people love her, but her confidence was much more believable and realistic in high school. She enters this business relationship with Alamo expecting to come out on top, which makes her look naive. And then there's the fact that she goes to Alamo and tells him that Rue is working with the DEA, even if she genuinely believed Rue was completely out of her mind when she said it. Repeating that information to someone like Alamo was an incredibly reckless thing to do. Moments like that leave me unsure of what to think about Maddie as a character anymore. Jules and Lexi are back this season as well. Jules is one of those characters who, with each passing season, seems to be given even less to do. The fact that she was the only character besides Rue to receive her own special episode, and that she remains the main love interest of the show's protagonist, makes this choice even more surprising. She is left largely isolated and doesn't have many scenes this season. There are some interesting ideas connected to her character, her life as a sugar baby, her relationship with an older man whose behavior and intentions immediately raise red flags, and her relationship with Rue. The problem is that none of it really goes anywhere. I mean, she gets wrapped in the plastic wrap. Why? Why do that to Hunter Schafer and then not have it lead anywhere? An odd choice if you ask me. As for Lexi, plot-wise, she stands out as a character whose absence wouldn't really change anything at all. She remains the easiest character to understand because she continues to go through struggles that feel grounded and relatable to regular people. She is still overshadowed by Cassie, even at work. Their mother also clearly loves Cassie more, and all of that just leaves you feeling bad for Lexi. Her role would likely have been bigger and more important this season if Fez was still around. Instead, she's left floating around the story, occasionally colliding with some of the other characters. And that brings us to Alamo. He is arguably the most developed newcomer in this entire season. He receives his own episode, his own backstory, and at times more psychological exploration than some of the returning characters. The show suggests that his hatred of women stems from his resentment towards his mother. It implies that if she had not been so selfish, perhaps he would have not turned to a life of crime. The truth is that Alamo is a calculated, cold-hearted man who is no stranger to extreme violence. He talks to Maddie about settling down and having children, but after all those years as a criminal, that transformation does not seem possible. Alamo is a fun character to watch on screen, but he does not belong in the world of Euphoria. Everything surrounding him looks like it comes from a completely different planet. That feeling is reinforced by his final standoff with Ali. The scene is framed like two cowboys in a western, waiting for a signal to shoot. If this were something else, it might not even be bad, it might actually be more enjoyable, but it simply is not Euphoria. One thing I kept asking myself throughout this season was, what is Euphoria actually trying to say? The first two seasons could reasonably be treated as stories about addiction and everything that comes with it. This season, Sam Levinson shoots his characters into the stratosphere of blockbuster action movies, placing them in increasingly absurd situations. He had 4 years to write endings for these characters. What he delivered instead feels less like a conclusion and more like a personal vision that had little to do with his audience or the work that preceded it. Every character, as discussed in the previous chapter, was treated as something completely different. At times, they felt disconnected from the versions of themselves we had spent years getting to know. Two of the most criticized and discussed aspects of this season are nudity and religion. Nudity has always been part of this show. In the first 2 seasons, its presence was tied to insecurity, intimacy, love. It meant something. Now, much of the conversation surrounding it revolves around money, branding, and online monetization. The number of times Cassie and others talk about how much money there is to be made in the industry reads less like commentary or critique and more like an advertisement. The show also brings in characters from the world of direct sex work, Kitty and Magic, but instead of exploring something genuinely interesting, such as the differences and similarities between stripping, online work, and prostitution, we get long scenes of them crossing the border for plastic surgery in Mexico. There are some moments that let you briefly think that the show wants to go deeper. When Rue asks Kitty whether anyone's forcing her to do this, Kitty responds by saying, "I just like to dance." But her eyes, her entire expression, suggest that there's something more going on beneath the surface. The show never peels back those layers and instead simply walks away. Several metaphors, often presented through nudity, are deployed throughout the season without any clear purpose or meaning. Cassie the Giant sequence, beyond being a loose reference to the 1950s film Attack of the 50-Foot Woman, brings very little to the table other than the audience discomfort. The scene goes on for so long that whatever point it may have been trying to make eventually gets lost. The question of whether the sexualization of women in this show serves a purpose has been debated through its entire run, and season 3 does nothing to settle it. Speaking personally, nudity itself is not the issue. This is not a show anyone came into expecting modesty from. It is also worth noting that the same actresses carry this burden almost every time, while male nudity is clearly non-existent this season. Religion is another subject that became much more prominent this season. It would be inaccurate to say that religion was never present in Euphoria. It simply wasn't this visible. In earlier seasons, religious themes were intertwined more naturally into conversations about redemption, forgiveness, accountability, and recovery. They were especially present in Rue's special episode with Ali, so it isn't surprising that religion becomes part of her character development. That part feels right. Rue is in over her head. She is looking for comfort. She wants to return to something simple and safe. Her growing interest in religion seems to begin after she visits the farm in the first episode, a place filled with people living quietly, away from the chaos of the world she had gotten herself tangled up in. That interpretation makes emotional sense for her character, even if the show never fully commits to it. The fact that Sam Levinson chose to kill Rue before the episode was even over, and then cut back to the farm, suggests he understood the desire for simplicity and peace, at least on some level. Even the image of Rue's mother reading the Bible in those flashes before we find out of Rue's passing reinforces the idea that she wanted to feel close to home, close to her mother, and close to a version of herself that still felt safe. What surprised me was how far these themes spread beyond Rue. Characters like Cassie, Maddie, and Lexi also become part of these conversations, which is where the show starts to lose me. With Rue, the religious imagery feels connected to her emotional state. With with some of the other characters, it's a bit too much, and sometimes unnecessary and out of character to talk about religion at all. That is part of the reason some viewers ended up describing this season as Christian propaganda, among many other things. The fact that audiences cannot even agree on what the season's religious message is might be the clearest sign of how ambiguous its themes ultimately were. But what was it that the audience actually needed from this show? We spent 3 years worrying about Rue, grieving alongside her, and watching the people around her fall apart because of her addiction. When she finally dies, we are not given the chance to feel it properly. We never see the reaction, we never get to say the proper goodbye. The whole ending of the show is dedicated to some higher meaning that may not even be there, instead of the characters we spent 3 seasons caring about. Thank you all so much for your support. It genuinely means the world to me. I never expected this channel to grow the way it has, and I'm incredibly grateful to everyone who watches, likes, comments, and subscribes. Thank you for being here, and I'll see you in the next one.